I have several cam clamps and I wanted to make one that had a longer reach. The ones I have have a shorter reach. I built them specifically for a guitar project, as you see here. I like everything about the clamps that I have as far as the dimensions, except for the reach, the distance between the jaws and the bar. Also, the ones I built used a 1" by 1/4" aluminum bar, and I'm going to try to make one using a wooden bar, and I'll comment on that in a moment. So what I'm using here is the jaws from my existing clamps to trace, because I like the shape, and all I'm going to do is basically lengthen them so that midsection where it's at its narrowest will just be a couple of inches longer, and the jaw will work just as well and allow me to reach deeper into a project if I want to clamp it. So I just simply took one of my other clamps apart and laid it down on this piece of cherry. It's a piece of 5/4 cherry, so they're approximately an inch thick, probably closer to 15/16 thick. And I just scribed these out on a piece of literal scrap cherry. I let the length of the cherry dictate the length of the clamp. I built these for close to nothing, so it wasn't a big outlay to put these together. So here I am just setting my table saw to the height of a given jaw, and I'm going to rip the piece of cherry so that I can get all of the pieces for the clamp out of just one rip. It's about 2 1/8 inches. The rip is about 2 1/8 inches, again by 5/4. Then to do that hollowed out part, to get a nice smooth look to that where it's recessed and hollowed out, I just chopped away at the side of the jaws just by making a bunch of passes on my table saw with the blade set at approximately at the height I want that cutout to be, and then just ate it all out, just split them out with my fingers. And then I'm going to make a jig in order to route a smooth surface to that cutout, and to also get a nice radius where the two corners are. They'll be radiused. So I just used a piece of scrap plywood, raised the blade through it at the proper depth, made a couple of cuts this way to be my left and right guide, and then I'm going to use a bearing guided router bit to basically smooth that chopped area and to radius the two corners. And so the piece of plywood will be the guide for the bearing on the bit. Had two choices. I had a top bearing bit and a bottom bearing bit. If I use the bottom bearing bit, I put the template below the piece I want to shape. If I use the top bearing bit, I would have to put the template on top of the piece. That seemed a little shakier, so I went for the bottom bit. And you'll see here in a minute I just used double-sided tape to tape the template down to a piece of sacrificial plywood. I tape that down with double-sided tape, and then line up carefully the pieces I want to hollow out with that cutout on the template, and that template will guide the flush cut bottom bearing router bit to give me a very straight, clean edge on that cutout, and also two nice 1/2 inch radiuses because it's a 1/2 inch diameter bit. It's a flush cut bit where the bit diameter and the bearing diameter are equal. So double-sided tape seems to work pretty well for this, and I just bring my router up against it and slowly whittle away the left and right. I had to whittle a little bit of wood away to get down to that radius, but it worked really well. Ends up with a very smooth finish, and a lot easier than a whole bunch of sanding and or on a spindle sander. This way I just get a very clean flush edge with one pass of the router. Did the same on the other jaw with the router. Just sped this up here to show you how that finished out. Very nice finish on it. Now I'm going to cut these to length. I put a stop. You can see that clamp is holding a stop on my table saw sled, and I just bring that cutout up against that stop on the front side and back side of both jaws, and that way I get two jaws that are exactly going to be the same exact length. They're going to match when they come up against each other, so that when the clamp closes, it closes very flush. I get a very nice flush jaw to jaw contact from the clamp. There they are, side by side. Next thing I have to do is drill some holes to put the pins in that hold this together. And there's two size pins, a 1/4 inch pin and a 3/16 inch pin. And now in order to mortise these jaws, I have to mortise a 1 inch by 1/4 inch hole in the bottom jaw that will hold the stiffener, the vertical piece. And then I have to mortise about a 1 1/4 inch by a 1/4 inch hole in the top jaw, and you'll see why that's important in a minute. When you put those pins in, it allows you to loosen the jaw by tilting it a little bit, putting it to where it needs to go. Once it gets to the 90-degree position, it locks itself in place. So here's my mortising jig. I just use this sort of freehand. It's a 1/4 inch mortising bit with the mortising jig on my drill press. It was a little stubborn, so I took very small bites. I had to hold that piece down. I wanted to lift up with the bit, but after you get it going a little bit, it wasn't bad. It just takes small bites and get all the way through that board. You know, it's a fairly deep mortise. It's practically, well, it's a little over 2 inches deep by a 1/4 inch, so it's a narrow, deep mortise. But these square cutting mortising jigs and mortising bits work really well. You could have done this whole thing with a mortising chisel and a hammer. It probably wouldn't have been quite as neat, and certainly wouldn't have been as fast. These went through very quickly. Again, the bottom jaw, the hole is 1 inch by a 1/4 inch. The top jaw, it's more like 1 1/4 inches by a 1/4 inch. And again, I'll show you when I place those pins why that top jaw needs to be a little bit wider. Now I'm going to make the stiffener, and I didn't have any more pieces of 1 by 1/4 inch aluminum. Went to the hardware store and the price was out of control. And I happen to have a piece of this Padauk, or Padauk, or Padauk, I don't know how you pronounce it, P-A-D-A-U-K. It's an exotic wood. It is hard as rock. This piece of wood might as well be metal. Once I shape it down to 1 inch by 1/4 inch, especially on the 1 inch plane, you are not going to bend this piece of wood. It is super stiff. And in some ways it made a nicer clamp in that it was all wood with no metal parts. So here I just ripped it down to close to a 1/4 inch. I'm going to finish it up. Now cut its width at 1 inch. Again, it ends up being 1 by 1 1/4, just like those pieces of aluminum were on my original clamps. I'm just setting up my rip fence now for 1 inch. Once I've cut that 1/4 inch dimension out of that piece of wood. So you'll see I'm just ripping this now at 1 inch, and it's going to give me a rough cut piece, 12 inches long and 1 inch wide and a 1/4 inch thick. Now it's not perfect because I wanted it to be super smooth so that the upper jaw would slide on it easily like it does on the aluminum. So I ran it through, I checked my depth, checked my width, and I ran it through my planer to just get it fine-tuned down to a 1/4 inch. And this wood is so hard. The planer is nice and sharp. It came out just literally polished, that 1/4 inch depth. So I had now a perfect 1/4. I was able to fit that in those mortises, and it fit nice and tight. And so then I took a plane and took down the width a little bit, because it was right off the table saw. It was maybe 1.125 and I wanted it to be down to 1 inch so it would fit in the 1 inch by 1/4 inch mortise. So I just took my plane and kind of fine-tuned both edges of it to get it down to a width of 1 inch and a depth or a thickness of 1/4 inch. And so the final piece, again, it's hard as a rock. It looks great because it's wood, and in some ways goes together a lot easier when you're drilling it and stuff like that. Now I've taken those two jaws, they've been mortised. I wanted to soften them, so I put a 1/4 inch or an 1/8 inch 1/4 round bit, and I did a round over on all of the edges of the jaws to just soften them in your hand. So all I've done with these now, as I did the other parts, I just stuck them down to my table with a double-sided tape and ran a bearing guided 1/4 round bit around the outside of the two jaws. I did every surface except the actual jaw surface and where they come together at the stiffener. Here I've put the stiffener in the bottom jaw. I'm using a pin now to pin that down. Once that's pinned, I double check it to be 90 degrees with the bottom jaw. If I cut my mortises straight, I'm going to get a good 90 degrees. I double check it with the square, and it's right on the money at 90 degrees. So far, it's going together very well. The upper jaw, the placement of these pins is very critical. And I'm going to show you with a drawing here in a moment why the placement of these pins is critical. Because these pins protrude into that 1.25 inch mortise so that you can tip the upper jaw to adjust it, but when you get it to the 90 degrees or parallel with the lower jaw, it locks because it runs into those pins. Now when I put these pins in, guiding the drill with just my eye, I missed by a little ways and they were a little too tight. And so what I did is put that jaw, here's a drawing that shows you how these work. I'll just make this top piece invisible, and you'll see that those two pins ride up against that stiffener. When you want to move the jaw, you just tip it a little ways, like I'm going to do in SketchUp here. Just tip it like that, and once it's tipped, it's now loose to move up and down, and it moves super freely up and down. You get it to where you need it as you're clamping it down on whatever you are clamping in the clamp. That jaw goes back to 90 degrees, and those two pins lock into the stiffener, and you get a clamp that won't slip on you. So because I'd gotten those pins too far into the mortise, I just took the edge of a regular file, since they're just made out of steel and they weren't even hard steel. I took a file and just fine-tuned both pins so that my 1 inch stiffener would fit nicely in that upper jaw. And after just a little bit of filing, I got it tuned in just right to where it locks up very well at 90 degrees. The next thing I had to do is make the cam. I had to make this cut first. There's a skinny cut terminated on a hole so that the wood won't split, and I wanted that kerf in that cut to be as thin as it could be, and so I used my Japanese saw, and I just literally drew a straight line between the end of the jaw and the little termination hole for this cut, and cut it by hand, just keeping my eye on the pencil line. These saws kind of want to go straight on their own because they cut on the pull stroke, and after just a little bit of time, the saw is pretty scary sharp. After just a little bit of time, I'd cut that entire distance in a rip cut to make the part of the jaw that moves when you twist the cam. Again, this will be a little clearer in a moment if you've not seen how a cam clamp works. But this cut down to that hole allows that upper jaw to seize down on the lower jaw so that the clamp actually works like a clamp when you've twisted the cam. You'll see this action here. I can bend it now. So here's the cam. I'm going to do a cutaway of that. It's I simply took the top of the jaw, put it upside down on my saw table, and cut part of the way in with my saw blade in order to make a channel for the cam. And then it rotates on a pin just like that. And because it's a circle and you've off-centered the pin, the cam works like a cam. The farther you turn it, the more it presses down on the movable part of that jaw. And that's really as simple as a cam clamp is. There's the groove that cam will rest in. I'm showing you that there. And then I'm going to kind of size it up with one of my other cam clamps, and I'll make that cam part similar to the other one. It's just a piece of wood. It's an inch wide. It's about 3/16 thick. It's got a half circle at the end and with an off-center hole. And it's as simple as that. As you turn that, because of the off-center hole, the cam protrudes out of the jaw and presses down on the upper part of that jaw. So here's the piece of wood I made the cam out of. I happen to also have just some scrap laying around. This is Hickory. So this clamp has got a cherry body, a Padauk stiffening rod, and a Hickory cam. And none of that matters. You just want hardwood so that it'll kind of hold its shape and last through the years. These clamps are super, super handy. So once I had cut that strip of wood to the proper thickness for the slot that I put in that upper jaw, and I'd also cut it, I will now cut it to the proper length. At one end, as I said, at one end, it's just a 45-degree cut, just so you've got something to kind of catch your finger on when you want to activate that cam. So I'll cut one end of this 1-inch wide stick at a 45-degree angle, just to have, again, it's somewhat decorative and it's somewhat just handy to have a point that you can catch your finger on when you want to operate the cam. And then at the other end, I just found a washer that was 1 inch in diameter to draw a round hole on it. I'd draw a round radius on it. I literally used a little Japanese saw to clip those two corners off, and then some sandpaper to round that edge. And I got a very nice half circle. Placed it inside the cam, drilled that pin. There it is in the cam. Here's the pin going in. Again, that hole is off center on that half circle at the end of the cam, and it allows the cam to operate the way you want it to. So here I'm pounding that pin in. These pins came from the hardware store. Again, these are 3 of these are 1/4 inch, and this one at the end up here is 3/16. Not sure that matters, but that's what I used. Now I put some leather on the jaws of the clamp, and I've got this straight cutting kind of one-sided knife so you can hold it flush up against the wood and it'll cut a straight line down. And I just got a piece of leather. I'm going to glue the leather, the shiny side of the leather against the clamp. I wanted the rougher side of the leather to be on the gripping surface because it's nice to have a little bit of grippiness when you are clamping wood, especially wood that you've planed and is nice and smooth. It's nice to have a little grip, and so I'm going to glue the leather onto those faces with the rough side out. So I just cut them to a rough cut, and then I got some tacky glue, and basically I'm going to just glue those surfaces and clamp the clamp shut and wait for them to dry. And when I do that, I'm going to do it on a piece of wax paper so that I don't get squeeze out all over my table. I'll also put a piece of wax paper between the two pieces of leather, and as it dries, they'll stay nice and neat. They'll pull apart easily. I'll be able to pull the wax paper off when I'm done. I then will flush cut that leather to the edge of the jaw using that knife that I showed you a second ago. And once this is all dry, I'll have a finished clamp. I'm not sure the tacky glue is all that important. I think Elmer's would have worked, or any kind of tight bond. I happen to have some tacky glue. It's sort of a craft glue that people use on fabric and leather, and because I had it, that's what I used. I'm just painting it on those surfaces so that I'm going to get a nice bond. And again, I've cut those close, and I'll trim them when I'm done once it's dry. Put a piece of wax paper between them just in case there's some squeeze out that would get on those faces. I don't want this jaw to be stuck together once that glue dries. Lift up the cam to tighten it, and it's its own tightening clamp for the glue job. Once it's done, there it is. It's finished. I'm just going to operate it here for 2 seconds. I just open it up. I've got a stack of wood here, just all these little loose pieces of wood. I'm just going to cram them in here, tighten it down, and just see what kind of a grip I get. And sure enough, it's nice and grippy. Super sturdy little clamp. It's got a nice deep reach in case you are reaching way into a flat piece of wood and need to glue something down. Again, here are the short ones on the guitar project. This is what these were made for. These were really made specifically for gluing the bridge onto the face of a guitar. It allows you to reach into the body of the guitar and grab the bridge. And that's what those first 3 clamps I made were for this project. But I needed a deeper one, and this one now is nearly 8 inches deep to the jaw. Here it is next to the shorter clamps, and it's just turned out to be a very nice clamp. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please subscribe, and thank you for watching.